Welcome to the next episode of the podcast on negotiation. And today's episode will be with someone who's very special, someone whose paper I read at the very beginning of my academic career, negotiating with Romans, has made a great impact on me and on my career. This is how my adventure with negotiation started. He's a negotiation professor at Schulich School of Business at York University in Canada. He has spent decades thinking about what is actually international negotiation and how to master them successfully. Steve Weiss. Steve, great to have you with us.
Nice to be here.
Steve, you've had an extremely rewarding career in the field of negotiation, especially focusing on international negotiation. I'm always curious about how such journeys start. Could you share your story? How did your adventure with negotiation start?
It's a combination of fate, luck, and I guess persistence or passion. So the international part was preordained. My parents and I went to Japan when I was 5 months old, and I spent 10 years there. So international and cross-cultural experiences and interests were in my blood from the get-go. The negotiation part, that's probably where a lot of the luck came in. When I was in college, I was majoring in international affairs, which was very broad. It was a collection of government history, economics, and foreign language courses with no real focus. And I took a course in the religion department on war and peace literature. So we read books like John Hersey's Hiroshima and remarks All Quiet on the Western Front and so on. And remember, this was the early 70s. So this is when the resistance to the U.S.'s participation in the Vietnam War was really starting to rise. And part of sort of the zeitgeist. And we would be watching on the nightly news the body count of American soldiers, of Vietnamese soldiers, of Viet Cong. And I think somewhere in there I was thinking, what a lousy way to try to resolve conflict or disputes, to basically kill each other. So there was that sort of going on in the back of my head. And then this course on war and peace was fascinating. And what came out of it was a desire within international affairs to focus on conflict and conflict resolution. I also, to finish up college early, needed a couple of extra courses to take, and was in the college library browsing through summer school brochures and happened upon the Summer School in Peace Research, which was a 3-week, I think it was 3-week resident program up here in Canada. And I'm an American. This wasn't a natural. And it was sponsored by the Canadian Peace Research Institute. I came up here, participated in the course, and once again, that just reinforced this idea of focusing in on conflict and conflict resolution. It really captured my interest. I thought it was just a really interesting phenomenon as well. If you think of people from very different backgrounds and cultures trying to develop something together in collaboration, and there's just all sorts of ways that dynamic could go. Then after college was trying to figure out what to do, and I applied to schools in foreign service or diplomacy, law schools. And there was a unique program at the University of Pennsylvania called the Peace Science Unit, which had been created in the 60s by Walter Izard with help from Kenneth Boulding and others. And the name turned some people off, but basically what Izard wanted to do was simply use social science methods to study war and peace. There were a lot of peace studies programs, sort of softer courses and programs in the 70s, but he wanted to use rigorous methods to study the subject. I was accepted there. We were able to do, it was a small program, so we could pretty much do what we wanted to do. I focused in on international negotiation, and that was also the time when Dan Druckmann wrote his first book on social psychological aspects of negotiation that came out in the 70s, and Brown and Rubin's book on social psych came out in the mid 70s, and so on. So a lot of this stuff was developing, and I took advantage of it. I know this is a long answer. I'll take one more minute. The other thing that was terrific about being at Penn was Philadelphia was in many ways considered the mecca of alternative dispute resolution in the 70s. So there was a branch of the American Arbitration Association there, and a lot of the professors at the Wharton Business School were serving as arbitrators in labor in arbitrations. I sat in on those. There was a Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, one of the regional centers there, and they were mediators for labor management disputes. I got to know the mediators and followed them around and sat in on negotiations. Quakers had mediation training and so on. So I did a fair amount outside of campus on conflict resolution generally, in addition to my coursework. And then the final piece, which was just a luck of the draw, is a conference I'd met a consultant who was teaching international business negotiation at NYU, at New York University. And at the end of our meeting, she said, "You should get a hold of me sometime." And here's my number. And I called her once and there was no answer. I called her twice. There was no answer. And I pretty much thought I'd give up, but I gave it one more shot. And she answered. And as a result of that call, she said, "Why don't you come up and serve as a teaching assistant at the business school up at NYU on the course in international business negotiation that I'm teaching." And that worked itself into an offer to teach there full time. And that's when I made the jump from international negotiation more generally into international business negotiation. So that's a series of sort of lucky opportunities or occasions. And then the third piece, just making myself available and then going after opportunities when they came up, which is what my dad would call sort of serendipity. That was one of his favorite words. Opportunities come up, and if you're willing to go for it, then that's another piece of the puzzle. So again, sort of destiny, luck, and passion. And I started teaching in a university in 1979 while I was still a doctoral student. I started at NYU in '83. So yes, I've been at negotiation, teaching, and research for a long time.
What an amazing career. What an amazing career, Steve. Congratulations. You are an accomplished scholar and a great professor. When you look back at this whole legacy of research on international negotiation, is decades of work, you and many other colleagues from the field. What do you think has changed in the way we look at international negotiations and in the way we conduct them? Yes. Do you see any major seismic shifts? Do you see any gradual changes, maybe evolutionary changes in the field? What is your take on this?
We can look at both research and practice, and I would actually trace the beginning of the field of, let's say, international business negotiation back to 1970, even before getting to YES, which was 1981, 11 years later. There was actually a course called International Business Negotiation taught at NYU beginning in, I think, the spring of 1968. And originally it was introduced by two IB professors in strategy, I think, as a way as a teaching tool. not as a subject in and of itself, but as a way to get sort of core concepts of international business across the students and to engage the students more and so on. I don't know if they knew what would happen over the next 50 years. But it has been 50 years, and you can think of the 50 years in blocks of 10, and I've sort of identified five stages, but we can go to those later. What's happened over those 50 years? I think with respect to research, a couple of things. One is that the whole idea of what international business negotiations has actually been narrowed into a real focus on culture. And I see culture as only a piece of the international business context. If you think of the classic PESTEL or PEST concept of aspects of the international business environment or business environment, culture is just a piece, and there are a whole lot of other factors that can influence what goes on in negotiation, but work on those other factors hasn't been nearly as strong, and it's actually diminished. I think it was much stronger when in the 70s and 80s, and over time, it's culture that has sort of taken over, and that's a function of where the resources are, if they're champions, research champions, and so on. The other thing is that I think there's been much more methodological rigor over time. We started with anecdotes about, how the Japanese negotiate or how the Chinese negotiate. And I think thanks largely to Jean Brett at Northwestern, who got going in the field in the early 90s and had a slew of doctoral students, and now her doctoral students have had doctoral students, and so on. Think of Tinsley and Lytle, and then Adair, and so on. And they've been very well trained in research methods, right? Especially sort of experimental methods, and that's been good to see. So that the conclusions they've reached are much more sort of credible or persuasive than some of the things that we saw early on in the field. Also, we've moved from one-off experiments, excuse me, I'm getting a bit hoarse already, to multiple studies. So instead of an article that just focuses on the results of one negotiation experiment, I think some of the really interesting work has been on experiments that are linked. Something has come up in one experiment, then a second one has been done, or role play to pursue it, and so on. So I think that's sort of what I've seen change over time with respect to research. With respect to practice, I think just huge changes. Think about access to information, right? Much more of information available for negotiators now, multiple sources. Of course, you've got the challenge of what's fake and what's valid, multiple channels of communication. It doesn't have to be face-to-face or telephonic. Now it can be email or video. And there's a challenge of using which channel for what part of your negotiations, and so on. I think there's much more familiarity with negotiation basics, thanks to a program on negotiation at Harvard, among other groups. I remember hearing a story at one Harvard seminar where they were talking about two presidents of two Latin American or South American countries, and they were sitting down to negotiate. I forget what the issue was, but one had sat down sort of at the head of the table, and one sat down sort of 90 degrees to him, as opposed to across the table, right? And the president who was already sitting said, "No, don't pull that getting to yes stuff on me. I know exactly how that works. And then I also heard a story about Japanese negotiators in the 80s taking a lot of seminars on negotiation in the US. But it was in order to learn how Americans negotiate. It wasn't in order for them to use these techniques in their own negotiations, as if they thought, they needed help with their negotiation techniques. So there's a lot more sort of theory and information about techniques out there. Outside pressures, audiences. You think of constituents, stakeholders, bad actors. I think it's much more challenging to hold negotiations in secret and to really focus on the principles and get something done without all this sort of noise from the outside. And then I think a real shift in geographical locations and sort of where the action is. I mean, in the 80s, Japan was a much stronger economic player than it is today. We've seen in the 90s, we saw the EU get a fair amount of attention in the triad economies. And of course, when China opened up in 1979 and 80 and then just took off, it's become the what is it, 800-pound gorilla, and you've got their Belt and Road initiative and all the negotiations going on there. So there's a lot more sort of a dispersion of negotiation, international negotiation activity. It's not just the OECD countries anymore. And then you got the BRICS, the Mint, the emerging economies, and so on. So just international negotiation going on in a lot more places than we used to sort of pay attention to. So some of that's interesting, some of it's challenging, but I think it's definitely significantly different from, say, the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm. Steve, I remember reading your paper, Negotiating with Romans, at the very early stages of my PhD program, and you tackled also, like many others at that point, the topic of culture. Yes, Syracuse demonstrated that we negotiate differently, and there has been lots of research into what those differences exactly are between the cultures that of our interest. Yes, I've noticed that in the last decade or two, this stream has become much weaker. Yeah? And I was wondering how you, as an expert on international negotiation, has seen the evolution in terms of our focus and interest in culture. Yeah? Has it changed in your opinion as well, or is it, I don't know, maybe we're focusing on more specific things within culture, or have we abandoned the topic at all?
No, I don't think we've abandoned it at all. And if you allow me, I'll start with a really long or slow wind up to the heart of the question. Before negotiating with Romans, I actually wrote a piece on cultural aspects of the negotiation process that vary with culture. And this was written in December of '84. And it was an attempt to provide an organizing framework for how to think about how culture affects negotiation. So I was at the time seeing a lot of work on negotiating with X, with the Japanese or what have you, but there wasn't a systematic approach. So what I did was take a look at the negotiation process and say, okay, which aspects of negotiation might vary significantly with culture? And I came up with 12 different dimensions and then applied them to 6 cultures that I thought were, at least on the face of it, fairly different. So Chinese, French, Japanese, Mexicans, Nigerians, and Saudis. And this was a 50-page paper, so it's definitely not journal length. There was no place to send it for publication, although it did get published by a German university in a book chapter, I think 10 years later. But Syracuse's 10 dimensions come out of those 12 dimensions. I don't know if he
I remember.
cited me in his paper. I don't think so, although he's certainly gotten a lot of credit for those 10 dimensions, but they're pretty much the ones that I laid out. And negotiating with Romans was a few years later, when I'd seen all this work on how people in other cultures negotiate, but there seemed to be just a presumption that that's all we need to know. So once we know how they negotiate, we'll just negotiate their way. Negotiating with Romans. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. And I thought, wait a minute, there are other things that you can do. And that's when I laid out the 5+3 strategic options, right? With respect to how much attention culture has gotten, it certainly got a lot of attention in the 80s and 90s from John Graham, among others. But I think John was probably one of the first to really look at culture systematically, rigorously using empirical methods. But then Jean Brett and her group got started in the early 90s. And I actually found an article by one of your colleagues, Professor Schoen, I guess it is, Schoen, I think. Does that ring a bell? Can you hear me, Remy?
Yes, I can hear.
Where he looked at 30 years, and when did that? It was an article published in 2 or 3 years ago, where he looked at research on cultural aspects of negotiation and cited a number of studies. I think there's still a fair amount of interest in cultural aspects of negotiation. I can't provide you with sort of a count, but I think there's still a lot going on. And certainly in that area more than sort of IB in sort of the broad sense of the word, negotiation. I'm just looking at my notes because I had written some things about. You asked whether interest had diminished or decreased, and I think that's where the action still is, actually. One of the things that I like about it is that I think others outside of the U.S. have picked up on it. So there's a fair amount of research going on in Europe and elsewhere. So sorry, I think I lost my train of thought. But your original question was: has interest in cultural aspects of negotiations diminished? And my short answer is I don't think so. I think where interest is diminished is in other aspects of international business negotiation, but culture seems to be moving right along. Some of the changes we've moved from behavior into emotions and cognition, so mental models. Okay. I also talked earlier about moving from anecdotal into more rigorous, rigorously studied topics in culture. And certainly an interest in different cultures. So we started in the 80s when John Graham started. Clearly, Japan was a focal point, right? I mean, the economy was firing on all cylinders. U.S. Japan was a big interest. Then the bubble burst in Japan, and it sort of fell flat from 1990 on. And at that point, China was picking up, so we shifted a lot of attention into research on negotiations involving the Chinese, and we're seeing some dispersion now beyond that. You can see pieces on negotiating with Vietnamese or Thais and so on. So I think it's been good that we've moved out into other areas. Let me stop there.
It's been a heck of a journey, right? 5 decades of research on international negotiations, and the evolution of the focus in terms of culture. So I understand we're still interested, but we're interested in specific aspects of it. Yes, I completely share this view. Yeah, I completely share
and
this
with
view.
any luck,
We
we'll move
started more.
out again.
Yes, exactly.
We'll start to increase other aspects of international. But so far, when you think about resources and who the researchers are and so on, Northwestern was just such a huge center of research activity because of the faculty, the number of doctoral students they had, and now sort of the generations that they really fueled the emphasis on cultural aspects of negotiation.
Yes, precisely. I know, Steve, that you've also spent a fair share of your time working on mega simulations, on modeling complex negotiation processes, like, for example, mergers or acquisitions of huge multinational companies, for example, from the automotive industries. Yeah? And I was wondering, what is the favorite negotiation that you've analyzed and converted, or not converted, maybe analyzed and not converted into a mega simulation, and what can we learn from it?
Yeah, mega simulations, and I've got to give credit to NYU for stimulating my interest in that area. So the first one I worked on, which was already in place at NYU, and I just built on it, was the GM and Toyota joint venture negotiations in the early 80s. And I'm not quite sure why NYU used these large-scale simulations. This negotiation course that they had was a substitute for a master's thesis. So back in the late 60s, to get an MBA, you also had to do a thesis. And NYU innovated by saying, well, we think there's other work that students can do which would be equivalent to a thesis. So they set up a management decision lab, a sort of a consulting project, and they set up this thing called International Business Negotiation Exercise. It was an 8-credit course, and we interviewed students. So it's highly selective. So we just put top students in there, which was great for the other students because they were negotiating against other high caliber students, right? But in any event, GM Toyota was already in place when I arrived there. And I ended up looking at IBM. And so that was a company to company joint venture negotiation, right? And then we also had a union and I think a government rep as well. I also looked at IBM's investment in Mexico when it decided to set up a PC assembly plant there. And more recently, when Renault partnered with Nissan to set up a strategic alliance between their two companies. I also looked at when Mitterrand became president of France and nationalized a whole bunch of companies. One of the sets of companies he wanted to nationalize was ITT subsidiaries. So you could create a national telecom champion in France. And the company that was in France at the time was Compagnie Générale d'Électricité, CGE. And he arranged for that company to take over the ITT subsidiaries, which formed Alcatel. I never fully developed that as a simulation, but that is something I looked into in depth. And NYU sold me on these experiences, and I've done them ever since. That was in 1983, and we're in 2023, and I'm still doing them. And the reason I do them is because they put my students as close to the real action as I can get them when they're still in the classroom. So they're highly complex. They have to think about a lot of factors when they're negotiating. Generally, we do 3 hours on Friday night and 5 hours on Saturday. And they prepare 2 weeks for 2 weeks before they go into them. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that we do afterwards in terms of analyses and so on. But it's a really rich and memorable experience. So from a teaching point of view, it's worked out really well. And I have developed these as case studies. So I have interviewed the actual negotiators in most of these cases. I've learned something from every one of them. A favorite case, well, Nissan and Renault were pretty interesting to me because of my Japan experience, and I've spent a fair amount of time in France. So the fact that I could look at a case involving two of my favorite countries or cultures was pretty special. But what I've learned the most from was a couple of paired cases. So when I was researching the GM-Toyota negotiations, I learned that Toyota had negotiated with Ford before they went to GM over pretty much exactly the same thing, a joint venture to assemble cars in the US. And those negotiations, which went on roughly the same amount of time as the GM-Toyota negotiations, 13 months or so, failed or were unsuccessful. And it was just really neat to have two real, not fictitious or experimental negotiations that were so similar, but with opposite results, no agreement and agreement. So I spent a lot of time interviewing negotiators from all three companies and trying to figure out why was there no agreement in the Ford Toyota case and an agreement in the GM Toyota case. And the takeaways, I think for one thing, the press generally settled on a single reason for failure or success. In the Ford Toyota case, well, they just couldn't agree on the product that they would build. Well, that was not even half the story. In the GM Toyota case, why did they reach agreement? Because their goals fit. You know, Toyota wanted to access the U.S. market and was concerned about building on its own, and GM couldn't make a cheap subcompact. Right? So product fit. Well, that was just part of the reason. So single factor explanations, especially for complex negotiations, are insufficient and misleading. Secondly, almost all complex negotiations have both agreement promoting factors as well as agreement impeding factors, right? So be careful about assuming when there's been no agreement that just everything went kaplooey or was set up against an agreement, or assuming that in the case of an agreement that everything was positive and of course they were going to reach an agreement. Just on the side, I remember interviewing one of the GM negotiators who said basically at the end of the negotiations, he was so sick of negotiating that once they'd reached an agreement, the GM team, who knows what kind of budget they had, it had to be significant. They could have gone out to the most expensive restaurant in Tokyo to celebrate the conclusion of the negotiations. He said they were so sick of all this stuff that they went to McDonald's to celebrate. The influence of factors outside the negotiation room. The reason why those two companies were negotiating at all is because the US government had slapped a restraint or constraint on Japanese imports into the US. So the only way that Japanese companies were going to be able to expand their market share was to actually build cars in the US. And then the last point is not all no agreement outcomes are bad, and not all agreement outcomes are good, right? And some of these same lessons I also saw in Alcatel-Lucent negotiations, which took place the same companies, right? First time in 2001, no agreement, and then they negotiated again in 2006, right? And that worked, formed Alcatel, and then ultimately Nokia bought Alcatel. But that's those pairwise comparisons of real negotiations have been the most fascinating and informative for me.
Thank you for sharing this, Steve. I think I also agree that we're missing in our domain, in the field of international negotiation. I wish we had more people like you who do the work in the field and study how real people resolve real negotiation problems. Yes, I'm also a big fan of experimental research and other research methods as well. But I wish we had more field studies in our domain. So we spent a lot of time talking about the past. The decades of research on international negotiation. Let's focus on the future now. If we look ahead and try to project the future of the field of international negotiation, what trends, what main directions, what is that you see when it comes to international negotiations of the future?
Once again, I'll divide my answer into research and practice. With respect to research, in 2007, I gave a public lecture in Geneva on the future of international business negotiation research. And I laid out 4 scenarios for the next 20 years. Right, we're almost there. But actually, it was just short of 20 years. It was out to 2025, so we're even closer than 2027. And the 4 scenarios were in the shadows, shining star, 1,000 pieces, and extinct. So
you have to explain these.
I will. So in the shadows was basically general negotiation would just take over, and international business would be a little piece in the corner, right? That it wouldn't really survive on its own, or not survive, but it would survive only under the umbrella of negotiation, broadly read. Shining star, it would attract all sorts of clever and dedicated researchers and come up with great ideas, not just for international business negotiation, but for negotiation, maybe even social science more generally. 1,000 pieces, a lot of research projects would be undertaken, a lot of work would be published, but it would be just all over the place. And then extinct, basically the flame would go out. No champions, no standard bearers, and just sort of die a natural or unfortunate death. And at this point, I feel like in the shadows is what's actually happened. That it hasn't been able to carve out a sort of niche that's widely known or recognized, that is really just seen as a piece of this broader field of negotiation. And you asked about culture losing momentum, and while I sort of thought, well, I don't think culture has lost momentum, I do think international business more broadly, international business negotiation has lost momentum. So I worry about what's going to happen down the line, because it takes researchers who are passionate about the subject, but not just passionate about the subject in and of itself, but are willing to sort of organize a community and throw resources at it and really sort of champion the area. And while I see a fair amount of work going on in various corners, I think that the critical mass and sort of the solid center just doesn't exist for international business negotiation the way I wish it did. With respect to practice, I think there are a lot of tough negotiations ahead. I think the stakes are high. I mean, we're talking about the future of the planet when it comes to climate change and so on. The international order that was established after World War II, I think, is under challenge. There are actors that are not content with the rules and norms that exist. I think a lot of different actors with different goals and values and sort of codes of conduct. A fair amount of resentment and fear and pushback against globalization. They're even talking about deglobalization now, so sort of more withdrawal and concern about what's going on within borders. Self-sufficiency, sort of buy American or buy U.S. in the U.S. And increasing pressure against the status quo from China and India and non-OECD countries. And then you've got bad actors and rogue actors, states like North Korea and so on. I think negotiating in that context or under those circumstances about those kinds of issues is going to be really challenging. And
Steve,
I actually hope for the best. I hope we'll negotiate effectively and come up with some creative and really good solutions and agreements.
So on the one hand, we have challenges that are coming at us at the speed of a freight train in a tunnel, and on the other hand, we have less and less people dealing with the topic in terms of research, the research focus. I hope we're not setting it up for a disaster, because someone has to deal with those challenges. Someone will have to solve them, right? And we need well-educated negotiators. To have well-educated negotiators, we need to have scientists, academics who deal with the topic of international negotiation. And I was wondering, Steve, if we let's pick one of the challenges that are coming at us unavoidably, and that is the climate change. Yes, it seems that this has become a pressing issue of the uttermost most importance to all of us on this planet. But for one reason or another, we cannot get a grip on it. Yes, it seems that those who have benefited from polluting the environment do not have that much interest in compensating those who haven't yet. And you, as an expert on international negotiations, do you have a solution? Do you have a set of advice? Do you have a remedy for this problem? How can we avoid a climate disaster?
You set me up. You as an expert, what's your advice? I agree with you. It's going to be really challenging. I mean, you think of the tragedy of the commons, right? Everyone wants to benefit from the commons, but when it comes to taking care of it or assuming some of the costs for restoring it or keeping it healthy, people step back. Or actors step back, and then the quality of the commons deteriorates. I think the climate is climate change, and just that whole area is a real challenge. And as I mentioned to you before we started, I think it is an extreme and really amazing example, troubling as well, of the tension between joint gain or community benefit and individual gain.
Yes.
You know, you were talking about the resentment, or the willingness to assign blame. You know, the economies that are developing now and being asked to bear burdens for costs that they think were incurred by the developed countries or the OECD countries, and you know, not seeing how that's fair to them. I think this is the negotiations are going to be really tough, and I'm reluctant when it comes to negotiations like this, or actually any real negotiation, to sort of pass on advice when I don't know enough about the subject itself. I think it's really important when it comes, if you're going to go beyond just sort of general rules of thumb and even sort of trite maxims or something about negotiation, and provide some real value add. I think it's incumbent on a person as an expert or as an advisor to really know the subject matter. This is an area that I certainly don't know enough about to be, you know, offering my 2 cents on.
Steve, how about advice for the participants of the in the negotiation challenge? This is our negotiation competition, which is going on as we speak. We just had our last qualification round, and we will hold a debrief and announce the finalists tomorrow. Yes, and I was wondering whether what would you tell them? Those are aspiring young graduate students, mostly graduate students, very passionate about the subject matter. Yes, preparing for our some of them preparing for our competition since October. Yes, have been seriously brushing up, developing their skills prior to the competition, and I was wondering if there is someone who whose advice they should take. It's definitely you. So, Steve, the floor is yours.
Remy, you're setting me up again.
Well, that's my role here.
First off, I want to say that I think what you and your colleagues have put together is fantastic. So kudos for that, and I hope you've got a long future ahead of you with this undertaking. I would give, I guess, 3 or 4 suggestions, general suggestions. The first is to think hard about what you really want before you enter the negotiations. What do you want to accomplish? What are your interests? What are sort of your concrete goals? And I think that that calls for some hard thinking. I mean, thinking about the different possible options and your preferences. And I think not enough young negotiators think through in advance, you know, what their preferences are. They think of a number of possibilities, but then they don't ask themselves, do I prefer for X over Y or Y over X? So I think that's key. And along with that, doing your homework. So gathering information about your own team, and not just your interests, but your resources. So it's not just what you can pull out or get out of a negotiation, but what you can contribute. And think also about the interests and resources of your counterparts. All right. So thinking hard about what it is you want to accomplish and doing your homework. That's sort of step 1. Step 2, and they're not necessarily in sequence here, even though I'm calling them steps. Consider your counterpart's perspective. So get out of your own head and try to look at the conflict, the subject matter from the perspective of the people that you're going to be negotiating with. How do they look at the subject? What do you think they want out of it? What are they likely to do in the negotiations? Third, take the initiative to set the agenda and to organize the negotiation process. Over the years, I found so many students who, especially early in the semester, sort of show up for the negotiations and expect something to happen to them. And then they realize, oh, it's up to you. Which is part of the beauty of negotiation, right? That you're not entering into a fixed or already determined game where there are certain rules and regulations. You say, as the disputants or as the parties to the conflict, the beauty of negotiation as opposed to adjudication or arbitration is that it's up to you, the parties, to set up the rules. You know, when you're going to meet, what you're going to meet about, how long you're going to meet, and so on. Okay. So again, oftentimes the other side may be thinking the same thing. Well, we'll just show up and things will happen. So why not take the initiative to set things up yourself, right? And oftentimes you can get some advantage to doing that. And it's not necessarily an unfair advantage. It's just sort of taking the initiative to be proactive. And then finally, once you get going in the negotiations, pay attention to the action-reaction sort of dynamics and what's going on. And every once in a while, step back and see what's going on and assess whether it's working or not. One of the frameworks that I came up with, analytic frameworks that I came up with years ago when I was working on the IBM Mexico case, actually, it was called Relationships, Behaviors, and Conditions. And if you think of it in this sort of simplest form with relationships up at the top, and negotiation is about initiating or modifying a relationship, right? A connection. And what determines what those relationships become or what they're like? Well, the behavior of the parties and influencing conditions. And if you just analyze what's going on during negotiation in terms of those three sort of components, I think it helps you to sort out where you are in the process and how whether you're on a good path or one that needs to be modified. Know what you want. Think about the counterpart's perspective. Take the initiative when it comes to organizing and shaping the process, and monitor and sort of track how things are going as you're negotiating.
That sounds great, Steve. Thank you so much for sharing. My very last question is always about great negotiators. Yes, greatness, great negotiators, mediators, whichever domain you would prefer to choose. Who comes to your mind? Contemporary, historical, doesn't matter.
One of my mentors was a U.S. ambassador by the name of John McDonnell. And he had been appointed ambassador, that rank, not to a country, but to conferences like the International Labor Organization and so on. And he was appointed twice by both a Republican president and by a Democratic president to lead the U.S. delegations to these large conferences. And he always talked about you might have 100 parties to the negotiation, but coming up with sort of a small or working group where you could actually get something done, right? So breaking it down into something feasible or manageable, working with that, and then sort of disseminating or getting feedback from the rest of the parties. And I thought that was just a really useful technique. I think I've gotten tips from everyone that whose autobiography or accounts I've read. Richard Holbrooke, to End War. That was a book that I enjoyed thoroughly, and the quote that I pulled from it, which I think is useful for all of us to remember when we're negotiating, is the following: the negotiations were simultaneously cerebral and physical, abstract and personal, something like a combination of chess and mountain climbing. So when I'm talking to my students about preparing for negotiation, I talk about planning, goal setting and all that sort of stuff. But I also use the word preparing in a much broader sense. Get a good night's sleep, eat, have fuel in your body. Think about all that goes into your performing well in a negotiation, because remember, it's got all these demands on you. They're both intellectual or sort of cognitive, but also physical. They can be exhausting. I remember one of the labor mediators that I followed would often work through the night on negotiations, right? They'd have some contract deadline that they had to meet. And one of his tricks was to always pack a shirt. And just before breakfast, after they'd stayed up all night, he'd excuse himself, head to his hotel room, take a shower, and put on a fresh shirt, right? He was thinking about the physical demands and how they might influence negatively, right, his effectiveness as a mediator, as a participant in the negotiation. So that quote from Holbrook, and granted, the Dayton Accords were sort of not your typical international negotiation, but that quote, I think, just really reminded me that this activity called negotiation is as wonderful as it is, and as the great agreements that can come out of it, the value that can be created, are often very demanding, and we need to think about all those demands and be ready to meet them. Other than that, program on negotiation, Jim Sebanius has a series of videos, often with former U.S. Secretaries of State who pass on their gems from their experiences. Margaret Macmillan's Paris 1919 was a great book that talked about those negotiations after World War I with Wilson and Lloyd George and Clemenceau. There's a Netflix movie called Sergio. I don't know if you've heard about it, but Sergio, it was the protagonist. The film is about a UN official who was with the High Commission for Refugees, Sergio Vieira de Melo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correct, but it was based on a book by Samantha Powers, a biography about him called Chasing the Flame, and the negotiations he did in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, in Bosnia, in the Middle East, and so on. But a lot of the diplomats or politicians can talk about their negotiations in ways that businessmen in proprietary or private negotiations cannot. So I've learned a lot, especially from statesmen like that, when it comes to international negotiation, and generally, something from everyone that I've read.
Thank you so much, Steve, for sharing your thoughts on greatness in negotiation. And we are very thankful to have learned so much from you, not only today, but also in the past. And we are also looking forward to learning from you in the future. And so, to sum it up, international negotiation is more important than ever now. We have lots of challenges to solve, and those challenges are unlikely to be solved in any other way than through negotiation. And on the other hand, we need smart negotiators who are skilled and trained by those who have passion for the topic of international negotiation. Steve, thank you so much for being with us today, and until next time on the podcast on negotiation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.